Chapter 15 of The First Men in the Moon. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. This recording is by Mark Smith of Simpsonville, South Carolina. The First Men in the Moon by H.G. Wells. Chapter 15. The Giddy Bridge. Just for a moment that hostile pause endured. I supposed that both we and the Selenites did some very rapid thinking. My clearest impression was that there was nothing to put my back against, and that we were bound to be surrounded and killed. The overwhelming folly of our presence there loomed over me in black, enormous reproach. Why had I ever launched myself on this mad, inhuman expedition? Cavor came to my side and laid his hand on my arm. His pale and terrified face was ghastly in the blue light. "We can't do anything," he said. "It's a mistake. They don't understand. We must go, as they want us to go." I looked down at him, and then at the fresh Selenites who were coming to help their fellows. "If I had my hands free—" "It's no use," he panted. "No. We'll go." And he turned about and led the way in the direction that had been indicated for us. I followed, trying to look as subdued as possible, and feeling at the chains about my wrists. My blood was boiling. I noted nothing more of that cavern, though it seemed to take a long time before we had marched across it, or if I noted anything, I forgot it as I saw it. My thoughts were concentrated, I think, upon my chains and the Selenites, and particularly upon the helmeted ones with the goads. At first they marched parallel with us and at a respectful distance, but presently they were overtaken by three others, and then they drew nearer, until they were within arm's length again. I winced like a beaten horse as they came near to us. The shorter, thicker Selenite marched at first on our right flank, but presently came in front of us again. How well the picture of that grouping has bitten into my brain! The back of Cavor's downcast head, just in front of me, and the dejected droop of his shoulders, and our guide's gaping visage, perpetually jerking about him, and the goad-bearers on either side, watchful, yet open-mouthed, a blue monochrome. And after all, I do remember one other thing besides the purely personal affair, which is, that a sort of gutter came presently across the floor of the cavern, and then ran along by the side of the path of rock we followed, and it was full of that same bright blue luminous stuff that flowed out of the great machine. I walked close beside it, and I can testify it radiated not a particle of heat. It was brightly shining, and yet it was neither warmer nor colder than anything else in the cavern. Clang, clang, clang! We passed right under the thumping levers of another vast machine, and so came at last to a wide tunnel, in which we could even hear the pad of our shoeless feet, and which, save for the trickling thread of blue to the right of us, was quite unlit. The shadows made gigantic travesties of our shapes and those of the Selenites on the irregular wall and roof of the tunnel. Ever and again crystals in the walls of the tunnel scintillated like gems. Ever and again the tunnel expanded into a stalactitic cavern, or gave off branches that vanished into darkness. We seemed to be marching down that tunnel for a long time. Trickle, trickle, went the flowing light very softly, and our footfalls and their echoes made an irregular paddle, paddle. My mind settled down to the question of my chains. If I were to slip off one turn, so, and then to twist it, so. If I tried to do it very gradually, would they see I was slipping my wrist out of the looser turn? If they did, what would they do? "Bedford," said Cavor. "It goes down. It keeps on going down." His remark roused me from my sullen preoccupation. "If they wanted to kill us," he said, dropping back to come level with me, "there is no reason why they should not have done it." "No," I admitted. "That's true." "They don't understand us," he said. They think we are merely strange animals, some wild sort of mooncalf birth, perhaps. It will be only when they have observed us better that they will begin to think we have minds." "When you trace those geometrical problems," said I. "It may be that." We tramped on for a space. "You see," said Cavor, "these may be Selenites of a lower class." "The infernal fools!" said I viciously, glancing at their exasperating faces. "If we endure what they do to us—" "We've got to endure it," said I. "There may be others less stupid. This is the mere outer fringe of their world. It must go down and down, cavern, passage, tunnel, down at last to the sea, hundreds of miles below." His words made me think of the mile or so of rock and tunnel that might be over our heads already. It was like a weight dropping on my shoulders. "Away from the sun and air," I said. "Even a mine half a mile deep is stuffy," I remarked. "This is not anyhow. It's probable ventilation. The air would blow from the dark side of the moon to the sunlit, and all the carbonic acid would well out there and feed those plants. Up this tunnel, for example, there is quite a breeze. And what a world it must be! The earnest we have in that shaft, and those machines." "And the goad," I said. "Don't forget the goad." He walked a little in front of me for a time. "Even that goad," he said. "Well?" "I was angry at the time, but it was perhaps necessary we should get on. They have different skins and probably different nerves. They may not understand our objection, just as a being from Mars might not like our earthly habit of nudging." "They'd better be careful how they nudge me." "And about that geometry. After all, their way is a way of understanding, too. They begin with the elements of life and not of thought. Food, compulsion, pain. They strike at fundamentals." "There's no doubt about that," I said. He went on to talk of the enormous and wonderful world into which we were being taken. I realized slowly from his tone that even now he was not absolutely in despair at the prospect of going ever deeper into this inhuman planet burrow. His mind ran on machines and invention, to the exclusion of 1,000 dark things that beset me. It wasn't that he intended to make any use of these things, he simply wanted to know them. "After all," he said, "this is a tremendous occasion. It is the meeting of two worlds. What are we going to see? Think of what is below us here." "We shan't see much if the light isn't better," I remarked. "This is only the outer crust. Down below, on this scale, there will be everything. Do you notice how different they seem one from another? The story we shall take back." "Some rare sort of animal," I said, "might comfort himself in that way while they were bringing him to the zoo. It doesn't follow that we are going to be shown all these things." "When they find we have reasonable minds," said Cavor, "they will want to learn about the earth. Even if they have no generous emotions, they will teach in order to learn. And the things they must know, the unanticipated things." He went on to speculate on the possibility of their knowing things he had never hoped to learn on earth, speculating in that way, with a raw wound from that goad already in his skin. Much that he said I forget, for my attention was drawn to the fact that the tunnel along which we had been marching was opening out wider and wider. We seemed, from the feeling of the air, to be going out into a huge space. But how big the space might really be we could not tell, because it was unlit. Our little stream of light ran in a dwindling thread and vanished far ahead. Presently the rocky walls had vanished altogether on either hand. There was nothing to be seen but the path in front of us and the trickling, hurrying rivulet of blue phosphorescence. The figures of Cavor and the guiding Selenite marched before me. The sides of their legs and heads that were towards the rivulet were clear and bright blue. Their darkened sides, now that the reflection of the tunnel wall no longer lit them, merged indistinguishably in the darkness beyond. And soon I perceived that we were approaching a declivity of some sort, because the little blue stream dipped suddenly out of sight. In another moment, as it seemed, we had reached the edge. The shining stream gave one meander of hesitation, and then rushed over. It fell to a depth at which the sound of its descent was absolutely lost to us. Far below was a bluish glow, a sort of blue mist, at an infinite distance below, and the darkness the stream dropped out of became utterly void and black, save that a thing like a plank projected from the edge of the cliff and stretched out and faded and vanished altogether. There was a warm air blowing up out of the gulf. For a moment I and Cavor stood as near the edge as we dared, peering into a blue-tinged profundity, and then our guide was pulling at my arm. Then he left me and walked to the end of that plank and stepped upon it, looking back. Then when he perceived we watched him, he turned about and went on along it, walking as surely as though he was on firm earth. For a moment his form was indistinct, then he became a blue blur, and then vanished into the obscurity. I became aware of some vague shape looming darkly out of the black. There was a pause. "Surely," said Cavor. One of the other Selenites walked a few paces out upon the plank and turned and looked back at us unconcernedly. The others stood ready to follow after us. Our guide's expectant figure reappeared. He was returning to see why we had not advanced. "What is that beyond there?" I asked. "I can't see." "We can't cross this at any price," said I. "I could not go 3 steps on it," said Cavor, "even with my hands free." We looked at each other's drawn faces in blank consternation. "They can't know what it is to be giddy," said Cavor. "It's quite impossible for us to walk that plank." "I don't believe they see as we do. I've been watching them. I wonder if they know this is simply blackness for us. How can we make them understand?" "Anyhow, we must make them understand." I think we said these things with a vague half-hope the Selenites might somehow understand. I knew quite clearly that all that was needed was an explanation. Then, as I saw their faces, I realized that an explanation was impossible. Just here it was that our resemblances were not going to bridge our differences. Well, I wasn't going to walk the plank anyhow. I slipped my wrist very quickly out of the coil of chain that was loose, and then began to twist my wrist in opposite directions. I was standing nearest to the bridge, and as I did this 2 of the Selenites laid hold of me and pulled me gently towards it. I shook my head violently. "No go," I said. "No use. You don't understand." Another Selenite added his compulsion. I was forced to step forward. "I've got an idea," said Cavor, but I knew his ideas. "Look here," I exclaimed to the Selenites. "Steady on. It's all very well for you." I sprang round upon my heel. I burst out into curses, for one of the armed Selenites had stabbed me behind with his goad. I wrenched my wrists free from the little tentacles that held them. I turned on the goad-bearer. "Confound you!" I cried. "I've warned you of that. What on earth do you think I'm made of, to stick that into me? If you touch me again—" By way of answer, he pricked me forthwith. I heard Cavor's voice in alarm and entreaty. Even then I think he wanted to compromise with these creatures. "I say, Bedford," he cried, "I know a way." But the sting of that second stab seemed to set free some pent-up reserve of energy in my being. Instantly the link of the wrist chain snapped, and with it snapped all considerations that had held us unresisting in the hands of these moon creatures. For that second, at least, I was mad with fear and anger. I took no thought of consequences. I hit straight out at the face of the thing with the goad. The chain was twisted round my fist. There came another of those beastly surprises of which the moon world is full. My mailed hand seemed to go clean through him. He smashed like some softish sort of sweet with liquid in it. He broke right in. He squelched and splashed. It was like hitting a damp toadstool. The flimsy body went spinning a dozen yards and fell with a flabby impact. I was astonished. I was incredulous that any living thing could be so flimsy. For an instant I could have believed the whole thing a dream. Then it had become real and imminent again. Neither Cavor nor the other Selenites seemed to have done anything from the time when I had turned about to the time when the dead Selenite hit the ground. Everyone stood back from us too, everyone alert. That arrest seemed to last at least a second after the Selenite was down. Everyone must have been taking the thing in. I seemed to remember myself standing with my arm half retracted, trying also to take it in. "What next?" clamored my brain. "What next?" Then in a moment everyone was moving. I perceived we must get our chains loose, and that before we could do this, these Selenites had to be beaten off. I faced towards the group of the 3 goad-bearers. Instantly one threw his goad at me. It swished over my head, and I suppose went flying into the abyss behind. I leaped right at him with all my might as the goad flew over me. He turned to run as I jumped, and I bore him to the ground, came down right upon him, and slipped upon his smashed body and fell. He seemed to wriggle under my foot. I came into a sitting position, and on every hand the blue backs of the Selenites were receding into the darkness. I bent a link by main force, and untwisted the chain that had hampered me about the ankles, and sprang to my feet, with the chain in my hand. Another goad, flung javelin-wise, whistled by me, and I made a rush towards the darkness out of which it had come. Then I turned back towards Cavor, who was still standing in the light of the rivulet near the gulf, convulsively busy with his wrists, and at the same time jabbering nonsense about his idea. "Come on!" I cried. "My hands!" he answered. Then, realizing that I dared not run back to him, because my ill-calculated steps might carry me over the edge, he came shuffling towards me, with his hands held out before him. I gripped his chains at once to unfasten them. "Where are they?" he panted. "Run away. They'll come back. They're throwing things. Which way shall we go?" "By the light. To that tunnel, eh?" "Yes," said I, and his hands were free. I dropped on my knees and fell to work on his ankle bonds. Whack came something, I know not what, and splashed the livid streamlet into drops about us. Far away on our right a piping and whistling began. I whipped the chain off his feet and put it in his hand. "Hit with that," I said, and without waiting for an answer, set off in big bounds along the path by which we had come. I had a nasty sort of feeling that these things could jump out of the darkness onto my back. I heard the impact of his leaps come following after me. We ran in vast strides, but that running, you must understand, was an altogether different thing from any running on earth. On earth one leaps and almost instantly hits the ground again, but on the moon, because of its weaker pull, one shot through the air for several seconds before one came to earth. In spite of our violent hurry, this gave an effect of long pauses, pauses in which one might have counted 7 or 8. Step, and one soared off. All sorts of questions ran through my mind. Where are the Selenites? What will they do? Shall we ever get to that tunnel? Is Cavor far behind? Are they likely to cut him off? Then whack, stride, and off again for another step. I saw a Selenite running in front of me, his legs going exactly as a man's would go on earth. Saw him glance over his shoulder, and heard him shriek as he ran aside out of my way into the darkness. He was, I think, our guide, but I am not sure. Then in another vast stride the walls of rock had come into view on either hand, and in 2 more strides I was in the tunnel and tempering my pace to its low roof. I went on to a bend, then stopped and turned back, and plug, 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 Cavor came into view, splashing into the stream of blue light at every stride, and grew larger and blundered into me. We stood clutching each other. For a moment, at least, we had shaken off our captors and were alone. We were both very much out of breath. We spoke in panting, broken sentences. "You spoil it all," panted Cavor. "Nonsense!" I cried. "It was that or death." "What are we to do?" "Hide." "How can we?" "It's dark enough." "But where?" "Up one of these side caverns." "And then?" "Think." "Right. Come on." We strode on, and presently came to a radiating dark cavern. Cavor was in front. He hesitated, and chose a black mouth that seemed to promise good hiding. He went towards it and turned. "It's dark," he said. "Your legs and feet will light us. You're wet with that luminous stuff." "But—" A tumult of sounds, and in particular a sound like a clanging gong, advancing up the main tunnel, became audible. It was horribly suggestive of a tumultuous pursuit. We made a bolt for the unlit side cavern forthwith. As we ran along it, our way was lit by the irradiation of Cavor's legs. "It's lucky," I panted, "they took off our boots, or we should fill this place with clatter." On we rushed, taking as small steps as we could to avoid striking the roof of the cavern. After a time we seemed to be gaining on the uproar. It became muffled, it dwindled, it died away. I stopped and looked back, and I heard the pad of Cavor's feet receding. Then he stopped also. "Bedford," he whispered, "there's a sort of light in front of us." I looked and at first could see nothing. Then I perceived his head and shoulders dimly outlined against a fainter darkness. I saw also that this mitigation of the darkness was not blue, as all the other light within the moon had been, but a pallid grey, a very vague, faint white, the daylight color. Cavor noted this difference as soon or sooner than I did, and I think too that it filled him with much the same wild hope. "Bedford," he whispered, and his voice trembled. "That light! It is possible." He did not dare to say the thing he hoped. There came a pause. Suddenly I knew by the sound of his feet that he was striding toward that pallor. I followed him with a beating heart. Chapter 16. Points of View. The light grew stronger as we advanced. In a little time it was nearly as strong as the phosphorescence on Cavor's legs. Our tunnel was expanding into a cavern, and this new light was at the farther end of it. I perceived something that set my hopes leaping and bounding. "Cavor," I said, "it comes from above. I am certain it comes from above." He made no answer, but hurried on. Indisputably it was a grey light, a silvery light. In another moment we were beneath it. It filtered down through a chink in the walls of the cavern, and as I stared up, drip, came a drop of water upon my face. I started and stood aside. Drip, fell another drop quite audibly on the rocky floor. "Cavor," I said, "if one of us lifts the other, he can reach that crack." "I'll lift you," he said, and incontinently hoisted me as though I was a baby. I thrust an arm into the crack, and just at my fingertips found a little ledge by which I could hold. I could see the white light was very much brighter now. I pulled myself up by 2 fingers with scarcely an effort, though on earth I weigh 12 stone, reached to a still higher corner of the rock, and so got my feet on the narrow ledge. I stood up and searched up the rocks with my fingers. The cleft broadened out upwardly. "It's climbable," I said to Cavor. "Can you jump up to my hand if I hold it down to you?" I wedged myself between the sides of the cleft, rested knee and foot on the ledge, and extended a hand. I could not see Cavor, but I could hear the rustle of his movements as he crouched to spring. Then whack, and he was hanging to my arm, and no heavier than a kitten. I lugged him up until he had a hand on my ledge and could release me. "Confound it," I said. "Anyone could be a mountaineer on the moon," and so set myself in earnest to the climbing. For a few minutes I clambered steadily, and then I looked up again. The cleft opened out steadily, and the light was brighter. Only it was not daylight after all. In another moment I could see what it was, and at the sight I could have beaten my head against the rocks with disappointment, for I beheld simply an irregularly sloping open space, and all over its slanting floor stood a forest of little club-shaped fungi, each shining gloriously with that pinkish, silvery light. For a moment I stared at their soft radiance, then sprang forward and upward among them. I plucked up half a dozen and flung them against the rocks, and then sat down, laughing bitterly as Cavor's ruddy face came into view. "It's phosphorescence again," I said. "No need to hurry. Sit down and make yourself at home." And as he spluttered over our disappointment, I began to lob more of these growths into the cleft. "I thought it was daylight," he said. "Daylight!" cried I. "Daybreak, sunset, clouds, and windy skies. Shall we ever see such things again?" As I spoke, a little picture of our world seemed to rise before me, bright and little and clear, like the background of some old Italian picture. The sky that changes, and the sea that changes, and the hills and the green trees and the towns and cities shining in the sun. Think of a wet roof at sunset, Cavor. Think of the windows of a westward house." He made no answer. "Here we are burrowing in this beastly world that isn't a world, with its inky ocean hidden in some abominable blackness below, and outside that, torrid day and that death stillness of night. And all these things that are chasing us now, beastly men of leather, insect men that come out of a nightmare. After all, they're right. What business have we here smashing them and disturbing their world? For all we know, the whole planet is up and after us already. In a minute we may hear them whimpering, and their gongs going. What are we to do? What are we to do? Here we are as comfortable as snakes from jamracks loose in a Surbiton villa." "It was your fault," said Cavor. "My fault?" I shouted. "Good Lord! I had an idea." "Curse your ideas." "If we had refused to budge—" "Under those goads?" "Yes, they would have carried us." "Over that bridge?" "Yes, they must have carried us from outside." "I'd rather be carried by a fly across a ceiling." "Good heavens!" I resumed my destruction of the fungi. Then suddenly I saw something that struck me even then. "Cavor," I said, "these chains are of gold." He was thinking intently, with his hands gripping his cheeks. He turned his head slowly and stared at me, and when I had repeated my words, at the twisted chain about his right hand. "So they are," he said. "So they are." His face lost its transitory interest even as he looked. He hesitated for a moment, then went on with his interrupted meditation. I sat for a space puzzling over the fact that I had only just observed this, until I considered the blue light in which we had been, and which had taken all the color out of the metal. And from that discovery I also started upon a train of thought that carried me wide and far. I forgot that I had just been asking what business we had in the moon. Gold. It was Cavor who spoke first. "It seems to me that there are two courses open to us." "Well?" "Either we can attempt to make our way, fight our way if necessary, out to the exterior again, and then hunt for our sphere until we find it, or the cold of the night comes to kill us, or else—" He paused. Yes, I said, though I knew what was coming. We might attempt once more to establish some sort of understanding with the minds of the people in the moon. So far as I'm concerned, it's the first. I doubt. I don't. You see, said Cavor, I do not think we can adjudge the Selenites by what we have seen of them. Their central world, their civilized world, will be far below in the profounder caverns about their sea. This region of the crust in which we are is an outlying district, a pastoral region. At any rate, that is my interpretation. These Selenites we have seen may be only the equivalent of cowboys and engine tenders. Their use of goads, in all probability mooncalf goads, the lack of imagination they show in expecting us to be able to do just what they can do, their indisputable brutality, all seem to point to something of that sort. But if we endured... Neither of us could endure a 6-inch plank across the bottomless pit for very long. No, said Cavor, but then... I won't, I said. He discovered a new line of possibilities. Well, suppose we got ourselves into some corner where we could defend ourselves against these hinds and laborers. If, for example, we could hold out for a week or so, it is probable that the news of our appearance would filter down to the more intelligent and populous parts. If they exist. They must exist, or whence came those tremendous machines? That's possible, but it's the worst of the two chances. We might write up inscriptions on walls. How do we know their eyes would see the sort of marks we made? If we cut them. Well, that's possible, of course. I took up a new thread of thought. After all, I said, I suppose you don't think these Selenites so infinitely wiser than men. They must know a lot more, or at least a lot of different things. Yes, but... I hesitated. I think you'll quite admit, Cavor, that you're rather an exceptional man. How? Well, you're a rather lonely man. Have been, that is. You haven't married. Never wanted to, but why? And you never grew richer than you happened to be? Never wanted that either. You've just rooted after knowledge? Well, a certain curiosity is natural. You think so. That's just it. You think every other mind wants to know. I remember once, when I asked you why you conducted all these researches, you said you wanted your FRS, and to have the stuff called Cavorite, and things like that. You know perfectly well you didn't do it for that, but at the time my question took you by surprise, and you felt you ought to have something to look like a motive. Really, you conducted researches because you had to. It's your twist. Perhaps it is. It isn't one man in a million has that twist. Most men want, well, various things, but very few want knowledge for its own sake. I don't, I know perfectly well. Now, these Selenites seem to be a driving, busy sort of being, but how do you know that even the most intelligent will take an interest in us or our world? I don't believe they'll even know we have a world. They never come out at night. They'd freeze if they did. They've probably never seen any heavenly body at all except the blazing sun. How are they to know there is another world? What does it matter to them if they do? Well, even if they have had a glimpse of a few stars, or even of the Earth crescent, what of that? Why should people living inside a planet trouble to observe that sort of thing? Men wouldn't have done it except for the seasons and sailing. Why should the moon people? Well, suppose there are a few philosophers like yourself. They are just the very Selenites who'll never have heard of our existence. Suppose a Selenite had dropped on the earth when you were at Lympne. You'd have been the last man in the world to hear he had come. You never read a newspaper. You see the chances against you. Well, it's for these chances we're sitting here doing nothing while precious time is flying. I tell you, we've got into a fix. We've come unarmed. We've lost our sphere. We've got no food. We've shown ourselves to the Selenites and made them think we're strange, strong, dangerous animals. And unless these Selenites are perfect fools, they'll set about now and hunt us till they find us. And when they find us, they'll try to take us if they can, and kill us if they can't. And that's the end of the matter. If they take us, they'll probably kill us, through some misunderstanding. After we're done for, they may discuss us perhaps, but we shan't get much fun out of that. Go on. On the other hand, here's gold knocking about like cast iron at home. If only we can get some of it back, if only we can find our sphere again before they do and get back, then... Yes? We might put the thing on a sounder footing, come back in a bigger sphere with guns. Good Lord! Cried Cavor, as though that was horrible. I shied another luminous fungus down the cleft. Look here, Cavor, I said. I've half that voting power anyhow in this affair, and this is a case for a practical man. I'm a practical man, and you are not. I'm not going to trust to Selenites and geometrical diagrams if I can help it. That's all. Get back. Drop all this secrecy, or most of it, and come again. He reflected. When I came to the moon, he said, I ought to have come alone. The question before the meeting, I said, is how to get back to the sphere. For a time we nursed our knees in silence. Then he seemed to decide for my reasons. I think, he said, one can get data. It is clear that while the sun is on this side of the moon, the air will be blowing through this planet's sponge from the dark side hither. On this side, at any rate, the air will be expanding and flowing out of the moon caverns into the craters. Very well, there's a draft here. So there is. And that means that this is not a dead end. Somewhere behind us this cleft goes on and up. The draft is blowing up, and that is the way we have to go. If we try to get up any sort of chimney or gully there is, we shall not only get out of these passages where they are hunting for us, but suppose the gully is too narrow? We'll come down again. Shh, I said suddenly. What's that? We listened. At first it was an indistinct murmur, and then one picked out the clang of a gong. They must think we are moon calves, said I, to be frightened at that. They're coming along that passage, said Cavor. They must be. They'll not think of the cleft, they'll go past. I listened again for a space. This time, I whispered, they're likely to have some sort of weapon. Then suddenly I sprang to my feet. Good heavens, Cavor, I cried. But they will. They'll see the fungi I've been pitching down. They'll... I didn't finish my sentence. I turned about and made a leap over the fungus tops towards the upper end of the cavity. I saw that the space turned upward and became a drafty cleft again, ascending to impenetrable darkness. I was about to clamber up into this, and then with a happy inspiration turned back. What are you doing? asked Cavor. Go on, said I, and went back and got two of the shining fungi, and putting one into the breast pocket of my flannel jacket so that it stuck out to light our climbing, went back with the other for Cavor. The noise of the Selenites was now so loud that it seemed they must be already beneath the cleft, but it might be they would have difficulty in clambering into it, or might hesitate to ascend it against our possible resistance. At any rate, we had now the comforting knowledge of the enormous muscular superiority our birth in another planet gave us. In another minute I was clambering with gigantic vigor after Cavor's blue-lit heels. The First Men in the Moon, by H.G. Wells, Chapter 17, The Fight in the Cave of the Moon Butchers. I do not know how far we clambered before we came to the grating. it may be we ascended only a few 100 feet, but at the time it seemed to me we might have hauled and jammed and hopped and wedged ourselves through a mile or more of vertical ascent. Whenever I recall that time, there comes into my head the heavy clank of our golden chains that followed every movement. Very soon my knuckles and knees were raw, and I had a bruise on one cheek. After a time, the first violence of our efforts diminished, and our movements became more deliberate and less painful. The noise of the pursuing Selenites had died away altogether. It seemed almost as though they had not traced us up the crack after all, in spite of the telltale heap of broken fungi that must have lain beneath it. At times the cleft narrowed so much that we could scarce squeeze up it. At others it expanded into great druzy cavities, studded with prickly crystals, or thickly beset with dull, shining fungoid pimples. Sometimes it twisted spirally, and at other times slanted down nearly to the horizontal direction. Ever and again there was the intermittent drip and trickle of water by us. Once or twice it seemed to us that small living things had rustled out of our reach, but what they were we never saw. They may have been venomous beasts for all I know, but they did us no harm, and we were now tuned to a pitch when a weird creeping thing more or less mattered little. And at last, far above, came the familiar bluish light again, and then we saw that it filtered through a grating that barred our way. We whispered as we pointed this out to one another, and became more and more cautious in our ascent. Presently we were close under the grating, and by pressing my face against its bars I could see a limited portion of the cavern beyond. It was clearly a large space, and lit no doubt by some rivulet of the same blue light that we had seen flow from the beating machinery. An intermittent trickle of water dropped ever and again between the bars near my face. My first endeavor was naturally to see what might be upon the floor of the cavern, but our grating lay in a depression whose rim hid all this from our eyes. Our foiled attention then fell back upon the suggestion of the various sounds we heard, and presently my eye caught a number of faint shadows that played across the dim roof far overhead. Indisputably there were several Selenites, perhaps a considerable number in the space, for we could hear the noises of their intercourse, and faint sounds that I identified as their footfalls. There was also a succession of regularly repeated sounds, chid, 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 which began and ceased, suggestive of a knife or spade hacking at some soft substance. Then came a clank as if of chains, a whistle, and a rumble as of a truck running over a hollowed place, and then again that chid, chid, chid resumed. The shadows told of shapes that moved quickly and rhythmically, in agreement with that regular sound, and rested when it ceased. We put our heads close together and began to discuss these things in noiseless whispers. "They are occupied," I said. "They are occupied in some way." "Yes." "They're not seeking us or thinking of us. Perhaps they have not heard of us. Those others are hunting about below. If suddenly we appeared here..." We looked at one another. "There might be chance to parley," said Cavor. "No," I said, "not as we are." For a space we remained, each occupied by his own thoughts. Chid, chid, chid went the chipping, and the shadows moved to and fro. I looked at the grating. "It's flimsy," I said. "We might bend 2 of the bars and crawl through." We wasted a little time in vague discussion. Then I took one of the bars in both hands and got my feet up against the rock until they were almost on a level with my head, and so thrust against the bar. It bent so suddenly that I almost slipped. I clambered about and bent the adjacent bar in the opposite direction, and then took the luminous fungus from my pocket and dropped it down the fissure. "Don't do anything hastily," whispered Cavor, as I twisted myself up through the opening I had enlarged. I had a glimpse of busy figures as I came through the grating, and immediately bent down, so that the rim of the depression in which the grating lay hid me from their eyes, and so lay flat, signaling advice to Cavor as he also prepared to come through. Presently we were side by side in the depression, peering over the edge at the cavern and its occupants. It was a much larger cavern than we had supposed from our first glimpse of it, and we looked up from the lowest portion of its sloping floor. It widened out as it receded from us, and its roof came down and hid the remoter portion altogether. And lying in a line along its length, vanishing at last far away in that tremendous perspective, were a number of huge shapes, huge pallid hulls, upon which the Selenites were busy. At first they seemed big white cylinders of vague import. Then I noted the heads upon them lying towards us, eyeless and skinless like the heads of sheep at a butcher's, and perceived they were the carcasses of moon calves being cut up, much as the crew of a whaler might cut up a moored whale. They were cutting off the flesh in strips, and on some of the farther trunks the white ribs were showing. It was the sound of their hatchets that made that chid, chid, chid. Some way away, a thing like a trolley cable, drawn and loaded with chunks of lax meat, was running up the slope of the cavern floor. This enormous long avenue of hulls that were destined to be food gave us a sense of the vast populousness of the moon world, second only to the effect of our first glimpse down the shaft. It seemed to me at first that the Selenites must be standing on trestle-supported planks, and then I saw that the planks and supports and the hatchets were really of the same leaden hue as my fetters had seen before white light came to bear on them. A number of very thick-looking crowbars lay about the floor, and had apparently assisted to turn the dead mooncalf over on its side. They were perhaps 6 feet long, with shaped handles, very tempting-looking weapons. The whole place was lit by 3 transverse streams of the blue fluid. Footnote: I do not remember seeing any wooden things on the moon. Doors, tables, everything corresponding to our terrestrial joinery was made of metal, and I believe for the most part of gold, which as a metal would, of course, naturally recommend itself, other things being equal, on account of the ease in working it and its toughness and durability. End of footnote. We lay for a long time noting all these things in silence. "Well?" said Cavor at last. I crouched over and turned to him. I had come upon a brilliant idea. "Unless they lowered those bodies by a crane," I said, "we must be nearer the surface than I thought." "Why?" "The mooncalf doesn't hop, and it hasn't got wings." We peered over the edge of the hollow again. "I wonder now," he began. "After all, we have never gone far from the surface." I stopped him by a grip on his arm. I had heard a noise from the cleft below us. We twisted ourselves about, and lay as still as death, with every sense alert. In a little while I did not doubt that something was quietly ascending the cleft. Very slowly and quite noiselessly I assured myself of a good grip on my chain, and waited for that something to appear. "Just look at those chaps with the hatchets again," I said. "They're all right," said Cavor. I took a sort of provisional aim at the gap in the grating. I could hear now quite distinctly the soft twittering of the ascending Selenites, the dab of their hands against the rock, and the falling of dust from their grips as they clambered. Then I could see that there was something moving dimly in the blackness below the grating, but what it might be I could not distinguish. The whole thing seemed to hang fire just for a moment. Then smash! I had sprung to my feet, struck savagely at something that had flashed out at me. It was the keen point of a spear. I have thought since that its length and the narrowness of the cleft must have prevented its being sloped to reach me. Anyhow, it shot out from the grating like the tongue of a snake, and missed, and flew back and flashed again. But the second time I snatched and caught it, and wrenched it away, but not before another had darted ineffectually at me. I shouted with triumph as I felt the hold of the selenite resist my pull for a moment and give, and then I was jabbing down through the bars, amidst squeals from the darkness, and Cavor had snapped off the other spear and was jabbing and flourishing it beside me and making inefficient jabs. Clang, clang came up through the grating, and then an axe hurtled through the air and whacked against the rocks beyond to remind me of the fleshers at the carcasses up in the cavern. I turned, and they were all coming towards us in open order, waving their axes. They were short, thick little beggars with long arms, strikingly different from the ones we had seen before. If they had not heard of us before, they must have realized the situation with incredible swiftness. I stared at them for a moment, spear in hand. "Guard the grating, Cavor!" I cried, howled to intimidate them, and rushed to meet them. 2 of them missed with their hatchets, and the rest fled incontinently. Then the 2 also were sprinting away up the cavern, with hands clenched and heads down. I never saw men run like them. I knew the spear I had was no good for me. It was thin and flimsy, only effectual for a thrust, and too long for a quick recover. So I only chased the selenites as far as the first carcass, and stopped there and picked up one of the crowbars that were lying about. It felt comfortingly heavy, and equal to smashing any number of selenites. I threw away my spear, and picked up a second crowbar for the other hand. I felt 5 times better than I had with the spear. I shook the 2 threateningly at the selenites, who had come to a halt in a little crowd far away up the cavern, and then turned about to look at Cavor. He was leaping from side to side of the grating, making threatening jabs with his broken spear. That was all right. It would keep the selenites down, for a time at any rate. I looked up the cavern again. What on earth were we going to do now? We were cornered in a sort of way already. But these butchers up the cavern had been surprised. They were probably scared, and they had no special weapons, only these little hatchets of theirs, and that way lay escape. Their sturdy little forms, ever so much shorter and thicker than the mooncalf herds, were scattered up the slope in a way that was eloquent of indecision. I had the moral advantage of a mad bull in a street. But for all that, there seemed a tremendous crowd of them. Very probably there was. Those selenites down the cleft had certainly some infernally long spears. It might be they had other surprises for us, but confound it, if we charged up the cave, we should let them up behind us, and if we didn't, those little brutes up the cave would probably get reinforced. Heaven alone knew what tremendous engines of warfare, guns, bombs, terrestrial torpedoes, this unknown world below our feet, this vaster world of which we had only pricked the outer cuticle, might not presently send up to our destruction. It became clear the only thing to do was to charge. It became clearer as the legs of a number of fresh selenites appeared running down the cavern towards us. "Bedford!" cried Cavor, and behold, he was halfway between me and the grating. "Go back!" I cried. "What are you doing?" They've got... It's like a gun!" And struggling in the grating between those defensive spears appeared the head and shoulders of a singularly lean and angular selenite, bearing some complicated apparatus. I realized Cavor's utter incapacity for the fight we had in hand. For a moment I hesitated. Then I rushed past him, whirling my crowbars, and shouting to confound the aim of the selenite. He was aiming in the queerest way with the thing against his stomach. Chuzz! The thing wasn't a gun. It went off like a crossbow more, and dropped me in the middle of a leap. I didn't fall down. I simply came down a little shorter than I should have done if I hadn't been hit, and from the feel of my shoulder the thing might have tapped me and glanced off. Then my left hand hit again the shaft, and I perceived there was a sort of spear sticking half through my shoulder. The moment after, I got home with the crowbar in my right hand and hit the selenite fair and square. He collapsed. He crushed and crumpled, his head smashed like an egg. I dropped a crowbar, pulled the spear out of my shoulder, and began to jab it down the grating into the darkness. At each jab came a shriek and a twitter. Finally I hurled the spear down upon them with all my strength, leaped up, picked up the crowbar again, and started for the multitude up the cavern. "Bedford!" cried Cavor. "Bedford!" as I flew past him. I seemed to remember his footsteps coming on behind me. Step, leap, whack, step, leap. Each leap seemed to last ages. With each, the cave opened out, and the number of Selenites visible increased. At first they seemed all running about like ants in a disturbed anthill, one or two waving hatchets and coming to meet me, more running away, some bolting sideways into the avenue of carcasses. Then presently others came in sight carrying spears, and then others. I saw a most extraordinary thing, all hands and feet, bolting for cover. The cavern grew darker farther up. Flick! Something flew over my head. Flick! As I soared in mid-stride, I saw a spear hit and quiver in one of the carcasses to my left. Then, as I came down, one hit the ground before me, and I heard the remote chuzz with which their things were fired. Flick! Flick! For a moment it was a shower. They were volleying. I stopped dead. I don't think I thought clearly then. I seem to remember a kind of stereotype phrase running through my mind. "Zone of fire, seek cover." I know I made a dash for the space between two of the carcasses, and stood there panting and feeling very wicked. I looked round for Cavor, and for a moment it seemed as if he had vanished from the world. Then he came out of the darkness between the row of the carcasses and the rocky wall of the cavern. I saw his little face, dark and blue, and shining with perspiration and emotion. He was saying something, but what it was I did not heed. I had realized that we might work from mooncalf to mooncalf up the cave until we were near enough to charge home. It was charge or nothing. "Come on," I said, and led the way. "Bedford!" he cried unfailingly. My mind was busy as we went up that narrow alley between the dead bodies and the wall of the cavern. The rocks curved about, they could not enfilade us. Though in that narrow space we could not leap, yet with our earth-born strength we were still able to go very much faster than the Selenites. I reckoned we should presently come right among them. Once we were on them, they would be nearly as formidable as black beetles. Only there would first of all be a volley. I thought of a stratagem. I whipped off my flannel jacket as I ran. "Bedford!" panted Cavor behind me. I glanced back. "What?" said I. He was pointing upward over the carcasses. "White light," he said. "White light again." I looked, and it was even so. A faint white ghost of light in the remoter cavern roof. That seemed to give me double strength. "Keep close," I said. A flat, long Selenite dashed out of the darkness and squealed and fled. I halted and stopped Cavor with my hand. I hung my jacket over my crowbar, ducked around the next carcass, dropped jacket and crowbar, showed myself, and darted back. Chuzz, flick! Just one arrow came. We were close on the Selenites, and they were standing in a crowd, broad, short, and tall together, with a little battery of their shooting implements pointing down the cave. 3 or 4 other arrows followed the first, then their fire ceased. I stuck out my head and escaped by a hair's breadth. This time I drew a dozen shots or more, and heard the Selenites shouting and twittering as if with excitement as they shot. I picked up jacket and crowbar again. "Now," said I, and thrust out the jacket. Chuzz, chuzz. In an instant my jacket had grown a thick beard of arrows, and they were quivering all over the carcass behind us. Instantly I slipped the crowbar out of the jacket, dropped the jacket. For all I know to the contrary, it is lying up there in the moon now, and rushed out upon them. For a minute, perhaps, it was a massacre. I was too fierce to discriminate, and the Selenites were probably too scared to fight. At any rate, they made no sort of fight against me. I saw scarlet, as the saying is. I remember I seemed to be wading among those leathery, thin things as a man wades through tall grass, mowing and hitting, first right, then left, smash. Little drops of moisture flew about. I trod on things that crushed and piped and went slippery. The crowd seemed to open and close and flow like water. They seemed to have no combined plan whatever. There were spears flew about me. I was grazed over the ear by one. I was stabbed once in the arm and once in the cheek, but I only found that out afterwards, when the blood had had time to run and cool and feel wet. What Cavor did, I do not know. For a space it seemed that this fighting had lasted for an age, and must needs go on forever. Then suddenly it was all over, and there was nothing to be seen but the backs of heads bobbing up and down as their owners ran in all directions. I seemed altogether unhurt. I ran forward some paces, shouting, then turned again. I was amazed. I had come right through them in vast flying strides. They were all behind me, and running hither and thither to hide. I felt an enormous astonishment at the evaporation of the great fight into which I had hurled myself, and not a little exultation. It did not seem to me that I had discovered the Selenites were unexpectedly flimsy, but that I was unexpectedly strong. I laughed stupidly. This fantastic moon. I glanced for a moment at the smashed and writhing bodies that were scattered over the cavern floor, with a vague idea of further violence, then hurried on after Cavor. Chapter 18. In the Sunlight. Presently we saw that the cavern before us opened upon a hazy void. In another moment we had emerged upon a sort of slanting gallery that projected into a vast circular space, a huge cylindrical pit running vertically up and down. Round this pit the slanting gallery ran without any parapet or protection for a turn and a half, and then plunged high above into the rock again. Somehow it reminded me of one of those spiral turns of the railway through the St. Gothard. It was all tremendously huge. I can scarcely hope to convey to you the titanic proportion of all that place, the titanic effect of it. Our eyes followed up the vast declivity of the pit wall, and overhead and far above we beheld a round opening set with faint stars, and half of the lip about it well nigh blinding with the white light of the sun. At that we cried aloud simultaneously. "Come on," I said, leading the way. "But there?" said Cavor, and very carefully stepped nearer the edge of the gallery. I followed his example, and craned forward and looked down, but I was dazzled by that gleam of light above, and I could see only a bottomless darkness, with spectral patches of crimson and purple floating therein. Yet if I could not see, I could hear. Out of this darkness came a sound like the angry hum one can hear if one put one's ear outside a hive of bees, a sound out of that enormous hollow, it may be, 4 miles beneath our feet. For a moment I listened, then tightened my grip on my crowbar, and led the way up the gallery. "This must be the shaft we looked down upon," said Cavor, "under that lid. And below there is where we saw the lights." "The lights," said he. "Yes, the lights of the world that now we shall never see." "We'll come back," I said, for now we had escaped so much I was rashly sanguine that we should recover the sphere. His answer I did not catch. "Eh?" I asked. "It doesn't matter," he answered, and we hurried on in silence. I suppose that slanting lateral way was 4 or 5 miles long, allowing for its curvature, and it ascended at a slope that would have made it almost impossibly steep on Earth, but which one strode up easily under lunar conditions. We saw only 2 Selenites during all that portion of our flight, and directly they became aware of us they ran headlong. It was clear that the knowledge of our strength and violence had reached them. Our way to the exterior was unexpectedly plain. The spiral gallery straightened into a steeply ascendant tunnel, its floor bearing abundant traces of the moon calves, and so straight and short in proportion to its vast arch that no part of it was absolutely dark. Almost immediately it began to lighten, and then far off and high up, and quite blindingly brilliant, appeared its opening on the exterior, a slope of alpine steepness surmounted by a crest of bayonet shrub, tall and broken down now, and dry and dead, in spiky silhouette against the sun. And it is strange that we men, to whom this very vegetation had seemed so weird and horrible a little time ago, should now behold it with the emotion a homecoming exile might feel at sight of his native land. We welcomed even the rareness of the air that made us pant as we ran, and which rendered speaking no longer the easy thing that it had been, but an effort to make oneself heard. Larger grew the sunlit circle above us, and larger, and all the nearer tunnels sank into a rim of indistinguishable black. We saw the dead bayonet shrub no longer with any touch of green in it, but brown and dry and thick, and the shadow of its upper branches high out of sight made a densely interlaced pattern upon the tumbled rocks. And at the immediate mouth of the tunnel was a wide trampled space where the mooncalves had come and gone. We came out upon this space at last, into a light and heat that hit and pressed upon us. We traversed the exposed area painfully, and clambered up a slope among the scrub stems, and sat down at last panting in a high place beneath the shadow of a mass of twisted lava. Even in the shade, the rock felt hot. The air was intensely hot, and we were in great physical discomfort, but for all that we were no longer in a nightmare. We seemed to have come to our own province again beneath the stars. All the fear and stress of our flight through the dim passages and fissures below had fallen from us. That last fight had filled us with an enormous confidence in ourselves so far as the Selenites were concerned. We looked back almost incredulously at the black opening from which we had just emerged. Down there it was, in a blue glow that now in our memories seemed the next thing to absolute darkness. We had met with things like mad mockeries of men, helmet-headed creatures, and had walked in fear before them, and had submitted to them until we could submit no longer. And behold, they had smashed like wax, and scattered like chaff, and fled and vanished like the creatures of a dream. I rubbed my eyes, doubting whether we had not slept and dreamt these things by reason of the fungus we had eaten, and suddenly discovered the blood upon my face, and then that my shirt was sticking painfully to my shoulder and arm. "Confound it," I said, gauging my injuries with an investigatory hand, and suddenly that distant tunnel mouth became, as it were, a watching eye. "Cavor," I said, "what are they going to do now, and what are we going to do?" He shook his head, with his eyes fixed upon the tunnel. "How can one tell what they will do?" "It depends on what they think of us, and I don't see how we can begin to guess that. And it depends upon what they have in reserve. It's as you say, Cavor, we have touched the merest outside of this world. They may have all sorts of things inside here. Even with those shooting things they might have made it bad for us. Yet after all," I said, "even if we don't find the sphere at once, there is a chance for us. We might hold out. Even through the night, we might go down there again and make a fight for it." I stared about me with speculative eyes. The character of the scenery had altered altogether by reason of the enormous growth and subsequent drying of the scrub. The crest on which we sat was high, and commanded a wide prospect of the crater landscape, and we saw it now all sere and dry in the late autumn of the lunar afternoon. Rising one behind the other were long slopes and fields of trampled brown, where the mooncalves had pastured, and far away in the full blaze of the sun a drove of them basked slumberously, scattered shapes, each with a blot of shadow against it like sheep on the side of a down. But never a sign of a Selenite was to be seen. Whether they had fled on our emergence from the interior passages, or whether they were accustomed to retire after driving out the mooncalves, I cannot guess. At the time I believed the former was the case. "If we were to set fire to all this stuff," I said, "we might find the sphere among the ashes." Cavor did not seem to hear me. He was peering under his hand at the stars, that still, in spite of the intense sunlight, were abundantly visible in the sky. "How long do you think we've been here?" he asked at last. "Been where?" "On the moon." 2 earthly days, perhaps? "More nearly 10. Do you know, the sun is past its zenith and sinking in the west. In 4 days' time or less it will be night." "But we've only eaten once." "I know that. But there are the stars." "But why should time seem different because we are on a smaller planet?" "I don't know. There it is." "How does one tell time?" "Hunger, fatigue, all those things are different. Everything is different. Everything. To me it seems that since first we came out of the sphere, it has been only a question of hours, long hours at most." 10 days, I said. That leaves... I looked up at the sun for a moment, and then saw that it was halfway from the zenith to the western edge of things. 4 days. Cavor, we mustn't sit here and dream. How do you think we may begin? I stood up. We must get a fixed point we can recognize. We might hoist a flag, or a handkerchief or something, and quarter the ground and work round that. He stood up beside me. "Yes," he said, "there is nothing for it but to hunt the sphere. Nothing. We may find it. Certainly we may find it. And if not, we must keep on looking." He looked this way and that, glanced up at the sky and down at the tunnel, and astonished me by a sudden gesture of impatience. "Oh, but we have done foolishly. To have come to this pass. Think how it might have been, and the things we might have done." "We might do something yet." "Never the things we might have done. Here below our feet is a world. Think of what that world must be. Think of that machine we saw, and the lid, and the shaft. They were just remote outlying things, and those creatures we have seen and fought with, no more than ignorant peasants, dwellers in the outskirts, yokels and laborers half akin to brutes. Down below, caverns beneath caverns, tunnels, structures, ways. It must open out and be greater and wider and more populous as one descends. Assuredly, right down at the last, a central sea that washes round the core of the moon. Think of its inky waters under the spare lights, if indeed their eyes need lights. Think of the cascading tributaries pouring down their channels to feed it. Think of the tides upon its surface, and the rush and swirl of its ebb and flow. Perhaps they have ships that go upon it. Perhaps down there are mighty cities and swarming ways, and wisdom and order passing the wit of man. And we may die here upon it, and never see the masters who must be ruling over all these things. We may freeze and die here, and the air will freeze and thaw upon us, and then they will come upon us, come on our stiff and silent bodies, and find the sphere we cannot find, and they will understand at last too late all the thought and effort that ended here in vain." His voice, for all that speech, sounded like the voice of someone heard in a telephone, weak and far away. "But the darkness," I said. "One might get over that." "How?" "I don't know. How am I to know? One might carry a torch, one might have a lamp. The others might understand." He stood for a moment with his hands held down, and a rueful face, staring out over the waste that defied him. Then, with a gesture of renunciation, he turned towards me with proposals for the systematic hunting of the sphere. "We can return," I said. He looked about him. "First of all, we shall have to get to Earth. We could bring back lamps to carry, and climbing irons, and 100 necessary things." "Yes," he said. "We can take back an earnest of success in this gold." He looked at my golden crowbars, and said nothing for a space. He stood with his hands clasped behind his back, staring across the crater. At last he sighed and spoke. "It was I found the way here. But to find a way isn't always to be master of a way. If I take my secret back to Earth, what will happen? I do not see how I can keep my secret for a year, for even a part of a year. Sooner or later it must come out, even if other men rediscover it. And then, governments and powers will struggle to get hither. They will fight against one another, and against these moon people. It will only spread warfare and multiply the occasions of war. In a little while, in a very little while, if I tell my secret, this planet to its deepest galleries will be strewn with human dead. Other things are doubtful, but that is certain. It is not as though man had any use for the moon. What good would the moon be to men? Even of their own planet, what have they made but a battleground and theater of infinite folly? Small as his world is, and short as is his time, he is still in his little life down there far more than he can do. No, science has toiled too long forging weapons for fools to use. It is time she held her hand. Let him find out for himself again, in 1,000 years' time. There are methods of secrecy, I said. He looked up at me and smiled. After all, he said, why should one worry? There is little chance of our finding the sphere, and down below things are brewing. It's simply the human habit of hoping till we die that makes us think of return. Our troubles are only beginning. We have shown these moon folk violence, and we have given them a taste of our quality, and our chances are about as good as a tiger's that has got loose and killed a man in Hyde Park. The news of us must be running down from gallery to gallery, down towards the central parts. No sane beings will ever let us take that sphere back to Earth after so much as they have seen of us. We aren't improving our chances, said I, by sitting here. We stood up side by side. After all, he said, we must separate. We must stick up a handkerchief on these tall spikes here and fasten it firmly. And from this as a center we must work over the crater. You must go westward, moving out in semicircles to and fro towards the setting sun. You must move first with your shadow on your right until it is at right angles with the direction of your handkerchief, and then with your shadow on your left. And I will do the same to the east. We will look into every gully, examine every skerry of rocks. We will do all we can to find my sphere. If we see the Selenites, we will hide from them as well as we can. For drink, we must take snow, and if we feel the need of food, we must kill a mooncalf if we can, and eat such flesh as it has, raw, and so each will go his own way. And if one of us comes upon the sphere, he must come back to the white handkerchief and stand by it and signal to the other. And if neither, Cavor glanced up at the sun, we go on seeking until the night and cold overtake us. Suppose the Selenites have found the sphere and hidden it? He shrugged his shoulders. Or if presently they come hunting us? He made no answer. You had better take a club, I said. He shook his head and stared away from me across the waste. But for a moment he did not start. He looked round at me shyly, hesitated. Au revoir, he said. I felt an odd stab of emotion. A sense of how we had galled each other, and particularly how I must have galled him, came to me. Confound it, thought I. We might have done better. I was on the point of asking him to shake hands, for that somehow was how I felt just then, when he put his feet together and leaped away from me towards the north. He seemed to drift through the air as a dead leaf would do, fell lightly, and leaped again. I stood for a moment watching him, then faced westward reluctantly, pulled myself together, and with something of the feeling of a man who leaps into icy water, selected a leaping point and plunged forward to explore my solitary half of the moon world. I dropped rather clumsily among rocks, stood up and looked about me, clambered onto a rocky slab, and leaped again. When presently I looked for Cavor, he was hidden from my eyes, but the handkerchief showed out bravely on its headland, white in the blaze of the sun. I determined not to lose sight of that handkerchief, whatever might betide. Chapter 19. Mr. Bedford Alone. In a little while it seemed to me as though I had always been alone on the moon. I hunted for a time with a certain intentness, but the heat was still very great, and the thinness of the air felt like a hoop about one's chest. I came presently into a hollow basin bristling with tall, brown, dry fronds about its edge, and I sat down under these to rest and cool. I intended to rest for only a little while. I put down my clubs beside me, and sat resting my chin on my hands. I saw with a sort of colorless interest that the rocks of the basin, where here and there the crackling dry lichens had shrunk away to show them, were all veined and spattered with gold, and that here and there bosses of rounded and wrinkled gold projected from among the litter. What did that matter now? A sort of languor had possession of my limbs and mind. I did not believe for a moment that we should ever find the sphere in that vast desiccated wilderness. I seemed to lack a motive for effort until the Selenites should come. Then I supposed I should exert myself, obeying that unreasonable imperative that urges a man before all things to preserve and defend his life, albeit he may preserve it only to die more painfully in a little while. Why had we come to the moon? The thing presented itself to me as a perplexing problem. What is this spirit in man that urges him forever to depart from happiness and security, to toil, to place himself in danger, to risk even a reasonable certainty of death? It dawned upon me up there in the moon, as a thing I ought always to have known, that man is not made simply to go about being safe and comfortable and well fed and amused. Almost any man, if you put the thing to him, not in words but in the shape of opportunities, will show that he knows as much. Against his interests, against his happiness, he is constantly being driven to do unreasonable things. Some force not himself impels him, and go he must. But why? Why? Sitting there in the midst of that useless moon gold, amidst the things of another world, I took count of all my life. Assuming I was to die a castaway upon the moon, I failed altogether to see what purpose I had served. I got no light on that point, but at any rate it was clearer to me than it had ever been in my life before that I was not serving my own purpose, that all my life I had in truth never served the purposes of my private life. Whose purposes, what purposes was I serving? I ceased to speculate on why we had come to the moon, and took a wider sweep. Why had I come to the earth? Why had I a private life at all? I lost myself at last in bottomless speculations. My thoughts became vague and cloudy, no longer leading in definite directions. I had not felt heavy or weary. I cannot imagine one doing so upon the moon, but I suppose I was greatly fatigued. At any rate, I slept. Slumbering there rested me greatly, I think, and the sun was setting and the violence of the heat abating through all the time I slumbered. When at last I was roused from my slumbers by a remote clamor, I felt active and capable again. I rubbed my eyes and stretched my arms. I rose to my feet. I was a little stiff, and at once prepared to resume my search. I shouldered my golden clubs, one on each shoulder, and went on out of the ravine of the gold-veined rocks. The sun was certainly lower, much lower than it had been, and the air was very much cooler. I perceived I must have slept some time. It seemed to me that a faint touch of misty blueness hung about the western cliff as I leapt to a little boss of rock and surveyed the crater. I could see no signs of mooncalves or Selenites, nor could I see Cavor. but I could see my handkerchief far off, spread out on its thicket of thorns. I looked about me, and then leaped forward to the next convenient viewpoint. I beat my round in a semicircle, and back again in a still remoter crescent. It was very fatiguing and hopeless. The air was really very much cooler, and it seemed to me that the shadow under the westward cliff was growing broad. Ever and again I stopped and reconnoitred, but there was no sign of Cavor, no sign of Selenites, and it seemed to me the moon calves must have been driven into the interior again. I could see none of them. I became more and more desirous of seeing Cavor. The winged outline of the sun had sunk now, until it was scarcely the distance of its diameter from the rim of the sky. I was oppressed by the idea that the Selenites would presently close their lids and valves, and shut us out under the inexorable onrush of the lunar night. It seemed to me high time that he abandoned his search, and that we took counsel together. I felt how urgent it was that we should decide soon upon our course. We had failed to find the sphere, we no longer had time to seek it, and once these valves were closed with us outside, we were lost men. The great night of space would descend upon us, that blackness of the void which is the only absolute death. All my being shrank from that approach. We must get into the moon again, though we were slain in doing it. I was haunted by a vision of our freezing to death, of our hammering with our last strength on the valve of the great pit. I took no thought any more of the sphere. I thought only of finding Cavor again. I was half inclined to go back into the moon without him, rather than seek him until it was too late. I was already halfway back towards our handkerchief, when suddenly I saw the sphere. I did not find it so much as it found me. It was lying much farther to the westward than I had gone, and the sloping rays of the sinking sun reflected from its glass had suddenly proclaimed its presence in a dazzling beam. For an instant I thought this was some new device of the Selenites against us, and then I understood. I threw up my arms, shouted a ghostly shout, and set off in vast leaps towards it. I missed one of my leaps and dropped into a deep ravine and twisted my ankle, and after that I stumbled at almost every leap. I was in a state of hysterical agitation, trembling violently, and quite breathless long before I got to it. 3 times at least I had to stop with my hands resting on my side, and in spite of the thin dryness of the air, the perspiration was wet upon my face. I thought of nothing but the sphere until I reached it. I forgot even my trouble of Cavor's whereabouts. My last leap flung me with my hands hard against its glass. Then I lay against it panting, and trying vainly to shout, "Cavor! Here is the sphere!" When I had recovered a little, I peered through the thick glass, and the things inside seemed tumbled. I stooped to peer closer. Then I attempted to get in. I had to hoist it over a little to get my head through the manhole. The screw stopper was inside, and I could see now that nothing had been touched, nothing had suffered. It lay there as we had left it when we had dropped out amidst the snow. For a time I was wholly occupied in making and remaking this inventory. I found I was trembling violently. It was good to see that familiar dark interior again. I cannot tell you how good. Presently I crept inside and sat down among the things. I looked through the glass at the moon world and shivered. I placed my gold clubs upon the table, and sought out and took a little food, not so much because I wanted it, but because it was there. Then it occurred to me that it was time to go out and signal for Cavor. But I did not go out and signal for Cavor forthwith. Something held me to the sphere. After all, everything was coming right. There would be still time for us to get more of the magic stone that gives one mastery over men. Away there, close handy, was gold for the picking up, and the sphere would travel as well half full of gold as though it were empty. We could go back now, masters of ourselves and our world, and then... I roused myself at last, and with an effort got myself out of the sphere. I shivered as I emerged, for the evening air was growing very cold. I stood in the hollow staring about me. I scrutinized the bushes round me very carefully before I leaped to the rocky shelf hard by, and took once more what had been my first leap in the moon. But now I made it with no effort whatever. The growth and decay of the vegetation had gone on apace, and the whole aspect of the rocks had changed, but still it was possible to make out the slope on which the seeds had germinated, and the rocky mass from which we had taken our first view of the crater. But the spiky shrub on the slope stood brown and sere now, and 30 feet high, and cast long shadows that stretched out of sight, and the little seeds that clustered in its upper branches were brown and ripe. Its work was done, and it was brittle and ready to fall and crumple under the freezing air, so soon as the nightfall came. And the huge cacti, that had swollen as we watched them, had long since burst and scattered their spores to the 4 quarters of the moon. Amazing little corner in the universe, the landing place of men. Some day, thought I will have an inscription standing there right in the midst of the hollow. It came to me, if only this teeming world within knew of the full import of the moment, how furious its tumult would become. But as yet it could scarcely be dreaming of the significance of our coming. For if it did, the crater would surely be an uproar of pursuit instead of as still as death. I looked about for some place from which I might signal Cavor, and saw that same patch of rock to which he had leapt from my present standpoint, still bare and barren in the sun. For a moment I hesitated at going so far from the sphere. Then, with a pang of shame at that hesitation, I leaped. From this vantage point I surveyed the crater again. Far away at the top of the enormous shadow I cast was the little white handkerchief fluttering on the bushes. It was very little and very far, and Cavor was not in sight. It seemed to me that by this time he ought to be looking for me. That was the agreement, but he was nowhere to be seen. I stood waiting and watching, hands shading my eyes, expecting every moment to distinguish him. Very probably I stood there for quite a long time. I tried to shout, and was reminded of the thinness of the air. I made an undecided step back towards the sphere, but a lurking dread of the Selenites made me hesitate to signal my whereabouts by hoisting one of our sleeping blankets onto the adjacent scrub. I searched the crater again. It had an effect of emptiness that chilled me, and it was still. Any sound from the Selenites and the world beneath had died away. It was as still as death. Save for the faint stir of the shrub about me and the little breeze that was rising, there was no sound, nor shadow of a sound, and the breeze blew chill. Confound Cavor! I took a deep breath. I put my hands to the sides of my mouth. "Cavor!" I bawled, and the sound was like some mannequin shouting far away. I looked at the handkerchief. I looked behind me at the broadening shadow of the westward cliff. I looked under my hand at the sun. It seemed to me that almost visibly it was creeping down the sky. I felt I must act instantly if I were to save Cavor. I whipped off my vest and flung it as a mark on the sere bayonets of the shrubs behind me, and then set off in a straight line towards the handkerchief. Perhaps it was a couple of miles away, a matter of a few hundred leaps and strides. I have already told how one seemed to hang through those lunar leaps. In each suspense I sought Cavor, and marveled why he should be hidden. In each leap I could feel the sun setting behind me. Each time I touched the ground I was tempted to go back. A last leap and I was in the depression below our handkerchief. A stride, and I stood on our former vantage point within arm's reach of it. I stood up straight and scanned the world about me, between its lengthening bars of shadow. Far away, down a long declivity, was the opening of the tunnel up which we had fled, and my shadow reached towards it, stretched towards it, and touched it, like a finger of the night. Not a sign of Cavor, not a sound in all the stillness, Only the stir and waving of the scrub and of the shadows increased. And suddenly and violently I shivered. "Go!" I began, and realized once more the uselessness of the human voice in that thin air. Silence. The silence of death. Then it was my eye caught something. A little thing lying, perhaps 50 yards away down the slope, amidst a litter of bent and broken branches. What was it? I knew, and yet for some reason I would not know. I went nearer to it. It was the little cricket cap Cavor had worn. I did not touch it. I stood looking at it. I saw then that the scattered branches about it had been forcibly smashed and trampled. I hesitated, stepped forward, and picked it up. I stood with Cavor's cap in my hand, staring at the trampled reeds and thorns about me. On some of them were little smears of something dark, something that I dared not touch. A dozen yards away, perhaps, the rising breeze dragged something into view, something small and vividly white. It was a little piece of paper crumpled tightly, as though it had been clutched tightly. I picked it up, and on it were smears of red. My eye caught faint pencil marks. I smoothed it out, and saw uneven and broken writing ending at last in a crooked streak up on the paper. I set myself to decipher this. "I have been injured about the knee. I think my kneecap is hurt, and I cannot run or crawl," it began, pretty distinctly written. Then less legibly, "They have been chasing me for some time, and it is only a question of—" The word time seemed to have been written here and erased in favor of something illegible. "Before they get me. They are beating all about me." Then the writing became convulsive. "I can hear them," I guessed the tracing meant, and then it was quite unreadable for a space. Then came a little string of words that were quite distinct. "A different sort of Selenite altogether, who appears to be directing the—" The writing became a mere hasty confusion again. "They have larger brain cases, much larger, and slenderer bodies, and very short legs. They make gentle noises and move with organized deliberation. And though I am wounded and helpless here, their appearance still gives me hope." That was like Cavor. "They have not shot at me or attempted injury. I intend—" Then came the sudden streak of the pencil across the paper, and on the back and edges, blood. And as I stood there stupid and perplexed, with this dumbfounding relic in my hand, something very soft and light and chill touched my hand for a moment and ceased to be, and then a thing, a little white speck, drifted athwart a shadow. It was a tiny snowflake, the first snowflake, the herald of the night. I looked up with a start, and the sky had darkened almost to blackness, and was thick with a gathering multitude of coldly watchful stars. I looked eastward, and the light of that shriveled world was touched with somber bronze. Westward, and the sun, robbed now by a thickening white mist of half its heat and splendor, was touching the crater rim, was sinking out of sight, and all the shrubs and jagged and tumbled rocks stood out against it in a bristling disorder of black shapes. Into the great lake of darkness westward a vast wreath of mist was sinking. A cold wind set all the crater shivering. Suddenly, for a moment, I was in a puff of falling snow, and all the world about me grey and dim. And then it was I heard, not loud and penetrating as at first, but faint and dim like a dying voice, that tolling, that same tolling that had welcomed the coming of the day. Boom! 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 It echoed about the crater. It seemed to throb with the throbbing of the greater stars. The blood-red crescent of the sun's disk sank as it toiled out. Boom! 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 What had happened to Cavor? All through that tolling I stood there stupidly, and at last the tolling ceased. And suddenly the open mouth of the tunnel down below there shut like an eye and vanished out of sight. Then indeed was I alone. Over me, around me, closing in on me, embracing me ever nearer, was the eternal, that which was before the beginning, and that which triumphs over the end, that enormous void in which all light and life and being is but the thin and vanishing splendor of a falling star, the cold, the stillness, the silence, the infinite and final night of space. The sense of solitude and desolation became the sense of an overwhelming presence that stooped towards me, that almost touched me. "No!" I cried. "No, not yet, not yet! Wait, oh, wait!" My voice went up to a shriek. I flung the crumpled paper from me, scrambled back to the crest to take my bearings, and then, with all the will that was in me, leaped out towards the mark I had left, dim and distant now in the very margin of the shadow. Leap, 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 and each leap was 7 ages. Before me the pale serpent-girdled section of the sun sank, and the advancing shadow swept to seize the sphere before I could reach it. I was 2 miles away, 100 leaps or more, and the air about me was thinning out as it thins under an air pump, and the cold was gripping at my joints. But had I died, I should have died leaping. Once, and then again my foot slipped on the gathering snow as I leaped and shortened my leap. I fell short into bushes that crashed and smashed into dusty chips and nothingness, and once I stumbled as I dropped and rolled head over heels into a gully, and rose bruised and bleeding and confused as to my direction. But such incidents were as nothing to the intervals, those awful pauses when one drifted through the air towards that pouring tide of night. My breathing made a piping noise, and it was as though knives were whirling in my lungs. My heart seemed to beat against the top of my brain. Shall I reach it? Oh, heaven, shall I reach it? My whole being became anguish. "Lie down!" screamed my pain and despair. "Lie down!" The nearer I struggled, the more awfully remote it seemed. I was numb, I stumbled, I bruised and cut myself, and did not bleed. It was in sight. I fell on all fours, and my lungs whooped. I crawled. The frost gathered on my lips. Icicles hung from my mustache. I was white with the freezing atmosphere. I was a dozen yards from it. My eyes had become dim. "Lie down!" screamed despair. "Lie down!" I touched it and halted. "Too late!" screamed despair. "Lie down!" I fought stiffly with it. I was on the manhole lip, a stupefied, half-dead being. The snow was all about me. I pulled myself in. There lurked within a little warmer air. The snowflakes, the air flakes, danced in about me as I tried with chilling hands to thrust the valve in and spun it tight and hard. I sobbed. "I will," I chattered in my teeth. And then, with fingers that quivered and felt brittle, I turned to the shutter studs. As I fumbled with the switches, for I had never controlled them before, I could see dimly through the steaming glass the blazing red streamers of the sinking sun, dancing and flickering through the snowstorm, and the black forms of the scrub thickening and bending and breaking beneath the accumulating snow. Thicker whirled the snow, and thicker, black against the light. What if even now the switches overcame me? Then something clicked under my hands, and in an instant that last vision of the moon world was hidden from my eyes. I was in the silence and darkness of the interplanetary sphere. Chapter 20. Mr. Bedford in Infinite Space. It was almost as though I had been killed. Indeed, I could imagine a man suddenly and violently killed would feel very much as I did. One moment, a passion of agonizing existence and fear. The next, darkness and stillness. Neither light nor life nor sun, moon nor stars. The blank infinite. Although the thing was done by my own act, although I had already tasted this very effect in Cavor's company, I felt astonished, dumbfounded and overwhelmed. I seemed to be borne upward into an enormous darkness. My fingers floated off the studs. I hung as if I were annihilated, and at last, very softly and gently, I came against the bale and the golden chain and the crowbars that had drifted to the middle of the sphere. I did not know how long that drifting took. In the sphere, of course, even more than on the moon, one's earthly time sense was ineffectual. At the touch of the bale it was as if I had awakened from a dreamless sleep. I immediately perceived that if I wanted to keep awake and alive, I must get a light or open a window, so as to get a grip of something with my eyes. And besides, I was cold. I kicked off from the bale, therefore, clawed on to the thin cords within the glass, crawled along until I got to the manhole rim, and so got my bearings for the light and blind studs, took a shove off, and flying once round the bale, and getting a scare from something big and flimsy that was drifting loose, I got my hand on the cord quite close to the studs and reached them. I lit the little lamp first of all to see what it was I had collided with, and discovered that old copy of Lloyd's News had slipped its moorings and was adrift in the void. That brought me out of the infinite to my own proper dimensions again. It made me laugh and pant for a time, and suggested the idea of a little oxygen from one of the cylinders. After that I lit the heater until I felt warm, and then I took food. Then I set to work in a very gingerly fashion on the Cavorite blinds to see if I could guess by any means how the sphere was traveling. The first blind I opened I shut at once, and hung for a time flattened and blinded by the sunlight that had hit me. After thinking a little, I started upon the windows at right angles to this one, and got the huge crescent moon and the little crescent earth behind it the second time. I was amazed to find how far I was from the moon. I had reckoned that not only should I have little or none of the kick-off that the Earth's atmosphere had given us at our start, but that the tangential fly-off of the moon's spin would be at least 28 times less than the Earth's. I had expected to discover myself hanging over our crater and on the edge of the night, but all that was now only a part of the outline of the white crescent that filled the sky. And Cavor? He was already infinitesimal. I tried to imagine what could have happened to him, but at that time I could think of nothing but death. I seemed to see him bent and smashed at the foot of some interminably high cascade of blue, and all about him these stupid insects stared. Under the inspiring touch of the drifting newspaper, I became practical again for a while. It was quite clear to me that what I had to do was to get back to Earth, but as far as I could see, I was drifting away from it. Whatever had happened to Cavor, even if he was still alive, which seemed to me incredible after that blood-stained scrap, I was powerless to help him. There he was, living or dead, behind the mantle of that rayless night, and there he must remain at least until I could summon our fellow men to his assistance. Should I do that? Something of the sort I had in my mind, to come back to Earth if it were possible, and then as mature consideration might determine, either to show and explain the sphere to a few discreet persons, and act with them, or else to keep my secret, sell my gold, obtain weapons, provisions, and an assistant, and return with these advantages to deal on equal terms with the flimsy people of the moon, to rescue Cavor, if that were still possible, and at any rate to procure a sufficient supply of gold to place my subsequent proceedings on a firmer basis. But that was hoping far. I had first to get back. I set myself to decide just exactly how the return to Earth could be contrived. As I struggled with that problem, I ceased to worry about what I should do when I got there. At last my only care was to get back. I puzzled out at last that my best chance would be to drop back towards the moon as near as I dared in order to gather velocity, then to shut my windows and fly behind it, and when I was past, to open my earthward windows and so get off at a good pace homeward. But whether I should ever reach the earth by that device, or whether I might not simply find myself spinning about it in some hyperbolic or parabolic curve or other, I could not tell. Later I had a happy inspiration, and by opening certain windows to the moon, which had appeared in the sky in front of the earth, I turned my course aside so as to head off the earth, which it had become evident to me I must pass behind without some such expedient. I did a very great deal of complicated thinking over these problems, for I am no mathematician, and in the end I am certain it was much more my good luck than my reasoning that enabled me to hit the earth. Had I known then, as I know now, the mathematical chances there were against me, I doubt if I should have troubled even to touch the studs to make any attempt. And having puzzled out what I considered to be the thing to do, I opened all my moonward windows and squatted down. The effort lifted me for a time some feet or so into the air, and I hung there in the oddest way, and waited for the crescent to get bigger and bigger until I felt I was near enough for safety. Then I would shut the windows, fly past the moon with the velocity I had got from it, if I did not smash upon it, and so go on towards the earth. And that is what I did. At last I felt my moonward start was sufficient. I shut out the sight of the moon from my eyes, and in a state of mind that was, I now recall, incredibly free from anxiety or any distressful quality, I sat down to begin a vigil in that little speck of matter in infinite space that would last until I should strike the earth. The heater had made the sphere tolerably warm, and the air had been refreshed by the oxygen, and except for that faint congestion of the head that was always with me while I was away from the earth, I felt entire physical comfort. I had extinguished the light again, lest it should fail me in the end. I was in darkness, save for the earth-shine and the glitter of the stars below me. Everything was so absolutely silent and still that I might indeed have been the only being in the universe. And yet, strangely enough, I had no more feeling of loneliness or fear than if I had been lying in bed on earth. Now, this seems all the stranger to me, since during my last hours in that crater of the moon, the sense of my utter loneliness had been an agony. Incredible as it will seem, this interval of time that I spent in space has no sort of proportion to any other interval of time in my life. Sometimes it seemed as though I sat through immeasurable eternities like some god upon a lotus leaf, and again as though there was a momentary pause as I leaped from moon to earth. In truth, it was altogether some weeks of earthly time. But I had done with care and anxiety, hunger or fear, for that space. I floated, thinking with a strange breadth and freedom of all that we had undergone, and of all my life and motives, and the secret issues of my being. I seemed to myself to have grown greater and greater, to have lost all sense of movement, to be floating amidst the stars, and always the sense of earth's littleness and the infinite littleness of my life upon it was implicit in my thoughts. I can't profess to explain the things that happened in my mind. No doubt they could all be traced directly or indirectly to the curious physical conditions under which I was living. I set them down here just for what they are worth, and without any comment. The most prominent quality of it was a pervading doubt of my own identity. I became, if I may so express it, dissociate from Bedford. I looked down on Bedford as a trivial, incidental thing with which I chanced to be connected. I saw Bedford in many relations, as an ass or as a poor beast, where I had hitherto been inclined to regard him with a quiet pride as a very spirited or rather forcible person. I saw him not only as an ass, but as the son of many generations of asses. I reviewed his school days, and his early manhood, and his first encounter with love, very much as one might review the proceedings of an ant in the sand. Something of that period of lucidity I regret still hangs about me, and I doubt if I shall ever recover the full-bodied self-satisfaction of my early days. But at the time, the thing was not in the least painful, because I had that extraordinary persuasion that, as a matter of fact, I was no more Bedford than I was anyone else, but only a mind floating in the still serenity of space. Why should I be disturbed about this Bedford's shortcomings? I was not responsible for him or them. For a time I struggled against this really very grotesque delusion. I tried to summon the memory of vivid moments, of tender or intense emotions to my assistance. I felt that if I could recall one genuine twinge of feeling, the growing severance would be stopped. But I could not do it. I saw Bedford rushing down Chancery Lane, hat on the back of his head, coat-tails flying out, en route for his public examination. I saw him dodging and bumping against, and even saluting, other similar little creatures in that swarming gutter of people. Me? I saw Bedford that same evening in the sitting-room of a certain lady, and his hat was on the table beside him, and it wanted brushing badly, and he was in tears. Me? I saw him with that lady in various attitudes and emotions. I never felt so detached before. I saw him hurrying off to Lympne to write a play, and accosting Cavor, and in his shirt-sleeves working at the Sphere, and walking out to Canterbury because he was afraid to come. Me? I did not believe it. I still reasoned that all this was hallucination due to my solitude, and the fact that I had lost all weight and sense of resistance. I endeavored to recover that sense by banging myself about the Sphere, by pinching my hands and clasping them together. Among other things, I lit the light, captured that torn copy of Lloyd's, and read those convincingly realistic advertisements about the cutaway bicycle, and the gentleman of private means, and the lady in distress who was selling those forks and spoons. There was no doubt they existed surely enough, and, said I, this is your world, and you are Bedford, and you are going back to live among things like that for all the rest of your life. But the doubts within me could still argue, it is not you that is reading, it is Bedford, but you are not Bedford, you know. That's just where the mistake comes in. Confound it, I cried. And if I am not Bedford, what am I? But in that direction no light was forthcoming, though the strangest fancies came drifting into my brain, queer remote suspicions, like shadows seen from far away. Do you know, I had a sort of idea that really I was something quite outside not only the world, but all worlds, and out of space and time, and that this poor Bedford was just a peephole through which I looked at life. Bedford. However I disavowed him, there I was most certainly bound up with him, and I knew that wherever or whatever I might be, I must needs feel the stress of his desires, and sympathize with all his joys and sorrows until his life should end. And with the dying of Bedford, what then? Enough of this remarkable phase of my experiences. I tell it here simply to show how one's isolation and departure from this planet touch not only the functions and feeling of every organ of the body, but indeed also the very fabric of the mind, with strange and unanticipated disturbances. All through the major portion of that vast space journey I hung thinking of such immaterial things as these, hung dissociated and apathetic, a cloudy megalomaniac, as it were, amidst the stars and planets in the void of space, and not only the world to which I was returning, but the blue-lit caverns of the Selenites, their helmet faces, their gigantic and wonderful machines, and the fate of Cavor, dragged helpless into that world, seemed infinitely minute and altogether trivial things to me. Until at last I began to feel the pull of the earth upon my being, drawing me back again to the life that is real for men. And then, indeed, it grew clearer and clearer to me that I was quite certainly Bedford after all, and returning after amazing adventures to this world of ours, and with a life that I was very likely to lose in this return. I set myself to puzzle out the conditions under which I must fall to earth. Chapter 21. Mr. Bedford at Littlestone. My line of flight was about parallel with the surface as I came into the upper air. The temperature of sphere began to rise forthwith. I knew it behooved me to drop at once. Far below me, in a darkling twilight, stretched a great expanse of sea. I opened every window I could, and fell, out of sunshine into evening, and out of evening into night. Vaster grew the earth, and vaster, swallowed up the stars, and the silvery translucent starlit veil of cloud it wore spread out to catch me. At last the world seemed no longer a sphere, but flat, and then concave. It was no longer a planet in the sky, but the world of man. I shut all but an inch or so of earthward window, and dropped with a slackening velocity. The broadening water, now so near that I could see the dark glitter of the waves, rushed up to meet me. The sphere became very hot. I snapped the last strip of window, and sat scowling and biting my knuckles, waiting for the impact. The sphere hit the water with a huge splash. It must have sent it fathoms high. At the splash I flung the Cavorite shutters open. Down I went, but slower and slower, and then I felt the sphere pressing against my feet, and so drove up again as a bubble drives. And at the last I was floating and rocking upon the surface of the sea, and my journey in space was at an end. The night was dark and overcast. 2 yellow pinpoints far away showed the passing of a ship, and nearer was a red glare that came and went. Had not the electricity of my glow lamp exhausted itself, I could have got picked up that night. In spite of the inordinate fatigue I was beginning to feel, I was excited now, and for a time hopeful, in a feverish, impatient way, that so my traveling might end. But at last I ceased to move about, and sat, wrists on knees, staring at a distant red light. It swayed up and down, rocking. My excitement passed. I realized I had yet to spend another night at least in the sphere. I perceived myself infinitely heavy and fatigued, and so I fell asleep. A change in my rhythmic motion awakened me. I peered through the refracting glass, and saw that I had come aground upon a huge shallow of sand. Far away I seemed to see houses and trees, and seaward a curved, vague distortion of a ship hung between sea and sky. I stood up and staggered. My one desire was to emerge. The manhole was upward, and I wrestled with the screw. Slowly I opened the manhole. At last the air was singing in again as once it had sung out. But this time I did not wait until the pressure was adjusted. In another moment I had the weight of the window on my hands, and I was open, wide open, to the old familiar sky of earth. The air hit me on the chest so that I gasped. I dropped the glass screw. I cried out, put my hands to my chest, and sat down. For a time I was in pain. Then I took deep breaths. At last I could rise and move about again. I tried to thrust my head through the manhole, and the sphere rolled over. It was as though something had lugged my head down directly it emerged. I ducked back sharply, or I should have been pinned face under water. After some wriggling and shoving I managed to crawl out upon sand, over which the retreating waves still came and went. I did not attempt to stand up. It seemed to me that my body must be suddenly changed to lead. Mother Earth had her grip on me now, no Cavorite intervening. I sat down, heedless of the water that came over my feet. It was dawn, a gray dawn, rather overcast, but showing here and there a long patch of greenish-gray. Some way out a ship was lying at anchor, a pale silhouette of a ship with one yellow light. The water came rippling in long, shallow waves. Away to the right curved the land, a shingle bank with little hovels, and at last a lighthouse, a sailing mark and a point. Inland stretched a space of level sand, broken here and there by pools of water, and ending a mile away perhaps in a low shore of scrub. To the northeast some isolated watering place was visible, a row of gaunt lodging-houses, the tallest things that I could see on earth, dull dabs against the brightening sky. What strange men can have reared these vertical piles in such an amplitude of space, I do not know. There they are, like pieces of Brighton lost in the waste. For a long time I sat there, yawning and rubbing my face. At last I struggled to rise. It made me feel that I was lifting a weight. I stood up. I stared at the distant houses. For the first time since our starvation in the crater I thought of earthly food. Bacon, I whispered. Eggs, good toast and good coffee. And how the devil am I going to get all this stuff to Lympne? I wondered where I was. It was an east shore anyhow, and I had seen Europe before I dropped. I heard footsteps crunching in the sand, and a little round-faced, friendly-looking man in flannels, with a bathing towel wrapped about his shoulders, and his bathing dress over his arm, appeared up the beach. I knew instantly that I must be in England. He was staring most intently at the sphere and me. He advanced, staring. I dare say I looked a ferocious savage enough, dirty, unkempt, to an indescribable degree, but it did not occur to me at the time. He stopped at a distance of 20 yards. "Hello, my man," he said doubtfully. "Hello yourself," said I. He advanced, reassured by that. "What on earth is that thing?" he asked. "Can you tell me where I am?" I asked. "That's Littlestone," he said, pointing to the houses. "And that's Dungeness. Have you just landed? What's that thing you've got? Some sort of machine?" "Yes." "Have you floated ashore? Have you been wrecked or something? What is it?" I meditated swiftly. I made an estimate of the little man's appearance as he drew nearer. "By Jove," he said, "you've had a time of it. I thought you... Well, where were you cast away? Is that thing a sort of floating thing for saving life?" I decided to take that line for the present. I made a few vague affirmatives. "I want help," I said hoarsely. "I want to get some stuff up the beach, stuff I can't very well leave about." I became aware of 3 other pleasant-looking young men with towels, blazers, and straw hats, coming down the sands toward me. Evidently the early bathing section of this Littlestone. "Help," said the young man. "Rather." He became vaguely active. "What particularly do you want done?" He turned round and gesticulated. The 3 young men accelerated their pace. In a minute they were there about me, plying me with questions I was indisposed to answer. "I'll tell all that later," I said. "I'm dead beat. I'm a rag." "Come up to the hotel," said the foremost little man. "We'll look after that thing there." I hesitated. "I can't," I said. "In that sphere there's 2 big bars of gold." They looked incredulously at one another, then at me with a new inquiry. I went to the sphere, stooped, crept in, and presently they had the Selenites' crowbars and the broken chain before them. If I had not been so horribly fagged, I could have laughed at them. It was like kittens round a beetle. They didn't know what to do with the stuff. The fat little man stooped and lifted the end of one of the bars, and then dropped it with a grunt. Then they all did. "It's lead, or gold," said one. "Oh, it's gold," said another. "Gold right enough," said the third. Then they all stared at me, and then they all stared at the ship lying at anchor. "I say," cried the little man, "but where did you get that?" I was too tired to keep up a lie. "I got it in the moon." I saw them stare at one another. "Look here," said I. "I'm not going to argue now. Help me carry these lumps of gold up to the hotel. I guess, with rest, 2 of you can manage one, and I'll trail this chain thing. And I'll tell you more when I've had some food." "And how about that thing?" "It won't hurt there," I said. "Anyhow, confound it, it must stop there now. If the tide comes up, it will float all right." And in a state of enormous wonderment, these young men most obediently hoisted my treasures on their shoulders, and with limbs that felt like lead, I headed a sort of procession towards that distant fragment of seafront. Halfway there we were reinforced by 2 awe-stricken little girls with spades, and later a lean little boy with a penetrating sniff appeared. He was, I remember, wheeling a bicycle, and he accompanied us at a distance of about 100 yards on our right flank, and then, I suppose, gave us up as uninteresting, mounted his bicycle, and rode off over the level sands in the direction of the sphere. I glanced back after him. "He won't touch it," said the stout young man reassuringly, and I was only too willing to be reassured. At first something of the grey of the morning was in my mind, but presently the sun disengaged itself from the level clouds of the horizon and lit the world, and turned the leaden sea to glittering waters. My spirits rose. A sense of the vast importance of the things I had done and had yet to do came with the sunlight into my mind. I laughed aloud as the foremost man staggered under my gold. When indeed I took my place in the world, how amazed the world would be! If it had not been for my inordinate fatigue, the landlord of the little stone hotel would have been amusing, as he hesitated between my gold and my respectable company on the one, and my filthy appearance on the other. But at last I found myself in a terrestrial bathroom once more, with warm water to wash myself with, and a change of raiment, preposterously small indeed, but anyhow clean, that the genial little man had lent me. He lent me a razor too, but I could not screw up my resolution to attack even the outposts of the bristling beard that covered my face. I sat down to an English breakfast and ate with a sort of languid appetite, an appetite many weeks old and very decrepit, and stirred myself to answer the questions of the 4 young men, and I told them the truth. "Well," said I, "as you press me, I got it in the moon." "The moon?" "Yes, the moon in the sky." "But how do you mean?" "What I say, confound it!" "Then you have just come from the moon?" "Exactly, through space, in that ball." And I took a delicious mouthful of egg. I made a private note that when I went back to the moon I would take a box of eggs. I could see clearly that they did not believe one word of what I told them, but evidently they considered me the most respectable liar they had ever met. They glanced at one another, and then concentrated the fire of their eyes on me. I fancied they expected a clue to me in the way I helped myself to salt. They seemed to find something significant in my peppering my egg. These strangely shaped masses of gold they had staggered under held their minds. There the lumps lay in front of me, each worth thousands of pounds, and as impossible for anyone to steal as a house or a piece of land. As I looked at their curious faces over my coffee cup, I realized something of the enormous wilderness of explanations into which I should have to wander to render myself comprehensible again. "You don't really mean," began the youngest young man, in the tone of one who speaks to an obstinate child. "Just pass me that toast rack," I said, and shut him up completely. "But look here, I say," began one of the others. "We're not going to believe that, you know." "Ah, well," said I, and shrugged my shoulders. "He doesn't want to tell us," said the youngest young man in a stage aside, and then with an appearance of great sang-froid, "You don't mind if I take a cigarette?" I waved him a cordial assent and proceeded with my breakfast. Two of the others went and looked out of the farther window and talked inaudibly. I was struck by a thought. "The tide," I said, "is running out?" There was a pause, a doubt who should answer me. "It's near the ebb," said the fat little man. "Well, anyhow," I said, "it won't float far." I decapitated my third egg and began a little speech. "Look here," I said, "please don't imagine I'm surly, or telling you uncivil lies, or anything of that sort. I'm forced almost to be a little short and mysterious. I can quite understand this is as queer as it can be, and that your imaginations must be going it. I can assure you, you're in at a memorable time. But I can't make it clear to you now. It's impossible. I give you my word of honor I've come from the moon, and that's all I can tell you. All the same, I'm tremendously obliged to you, you know, tremendously. I hope that my manner hasn't in any way given you offense." "Oh, not in the least," said the youngest young man affably. "We can quite understand." And staring hard at me all the time, he heeled his chair back until it very nearly upset, and recovered with some exertion. "Not a bit of it," said the fat young man. "Don't you imagine that?" And they all got up and dispersed, and walked about and lit cigarettes, and generally tried to show they were perfectly amiable and disengaged, and entirely free from the slightest curiosity about me and the sphere. "I'm going to keep an eye on that ship out there all the same," I heard one of them remarking in an undertone. "If only they could have forced themselves to it, they would, I believe, even have gone out and left me." I went on with my third egg. "The weather," the fat little man remarked presently, "has been immense, has it not? I don't know when we have had such a summer." Phoo whiz! Like a tremendous rocket, and somewhere a window was broken. "What's that?" said I. "It isn't," cried the little man, and rushed to the corner window. All the others rushed to the window likewise. I sat staring at them. Suddenly I leaped up, knocked over my third egg, rushed for the window also. I had just thought of something. "Nothing to be seen there," cried the little man, rushing for the door. "It's that boy!" I cried, bawling in hoarse fury. "It's that accursed boy!" And turning about, I pushed the waiter aside. He had just brung me some more toast, and rushed violently out of the room and down and out upon the queer little esplanade in front of the hotel. The sea, which had been smooth, was rough now with hurrying cat's paws, and all about where the sphere had been was tumbled water like the wake of a ship. Above, a little puff of cloud whirled like dispersing smoke, and the 3 or 4 people on the beach were peering up with interrogative faces towards the point of that unexpected report. And that was all. Boots and waiters and the 4 young men in blazers came rushing out behind me. Shouts came from windows and doors, and all sorts of worrying people came into sight, agape. for a time I stood there, too overwhelmed by this new development to think of the people. At first I was too stunned to see the thing as any definite disaster. I was just stunned, as a man is by some accidental violent blow. It is only afterwards he begins to appreciate his specific injury. Good Lord! I felt as though somebody was pouring funk out of a can down the back of my neck. My legs became feeble. I had got the first intimation of what the disaster meant for me. There was that confounded boy, sky high. I was utterly left. There was the gold in the coffee room, my only possession on earth. How would it all work out? The general effect was of a gigantic, unmanageable confusion. "I say," said the voice of the little man behind. "I say, you know." I wheeled about, and there were 20 or 30 people, a sort of irregular investment of people, all bombarding me with dumb interrogation, with infinite doubt and suspicion. I felt the compulsion of their eyes intolerably. I groaned aloud. "I can't," I shouted. "I tell you I can't. I'm not equal to it. You must puzzle and be damned to you." I gesticulated convulsively. He receded a step as though I had threatened him. I made a bolt through them into the hotel. I charged back into the coffee room, rang the bell furiously. I gripped the waiter as he entered. "Do you hear?" I shouted. "Get help and carry these bars up to my room right away." He failed to understand me, and I shouted and raved at him. A scared-looking little old man in a green apron appeared, and further 2 of the young men in flannels. I made a dash at them and commandeered their services. As soon as the gold was in my room, I felt free to quarrel. "Now get out!" I shouted. "All of you get out if you don't want to see a man go mad before your eyes." And I helped the waiter by the shoulder as he hesitated in the doorway. And then, as soon as I had the door locked on them all, I tore off the little man's clothes again, shied them right and left, and got into bed forthwith. And there I lay swearing and panting and cooling for a very long time. At last I was calm enough to get out of bed and ring up the round-eyed waiter for a flannel nightshirt, a soda and whiskey, and some good cigars. And these things being procured me, after an exasperating delay that drove me several times to the bell, I locked the door again and proceeded very deliberately to look the entire situation in the face. The net result of the great experiment presented itself as an absolute failure. It was a rout, and I was the sole survivor. It was an absolute collapse, and this was the final disaster. There was nothing for it but to save myself, and as much as I could in the way of prospects from our debacle. At one fatal crowning blow, all my vague resolutions of return and recovery had vanished. My intention of going back to the moon, of getting a sphere full of gold, and afterwards of having a fragment of Cavorite analyzed and so recovering the great secret, perhaps finally even of recovering Cavor's body, all these ideas vanished altogether. I was the sole survivor, and that was all. I think that going to bed was one of the luckiest ideas I have ever had in an emergency. I really believe I should either have got loose-headed or done some indiscreet thing. But there, locked in and secure from all interruptions, I could think out the position in all its bearings and make my arrangements at leisure. Of course, it was quite clear to me what had happened to the boy. He had crawled into the sphere, meddled with the studs, shut the Cavorite windows, and gone up. It was highly improbable he had screwed the manhole stopper, and even if he had, the chances were 1,000 to 1 against his getting back. It was fairly evident that he would gravitate with my bales to somewhere near the middle of the sphere and remain there, and so cease to be a legitimate terrestrial interest. however remarkable he might seem to the inhabitants of some remote quarter of space. I very speedily convinced myself on that point. And as for any responsibility I might have in the matter, the more I reflected upon that, the clearer it became that if only I kept quiet about things, I need not trouble myself about that. If I was faced by sorrowing parents demanding their lost boy, I had merely to demand my lost sphere, or ask them what they meant. At first I had had a vision of weeping parents and guardians and all sorts of complications, but now I saw that I simply had to keep my mouth shut, and nothing in that way could arise. And indeed, the more I lay and smoked and thought, the more evident became the wisdom of impenetrability. It is within the right of every British citizen, provided he does not commit damage nor indecorum, to appear suddenly wherever he pleases, and as ragged and filthy as he pleases, and with whatever account of virgin gold he sees fit to encumber himself, and no one has any right at all to hinder and detain him in this procedure. I formulated that at last to myself, and repeated it over as a sort of private Magna Charta of my liberty. Once I had put that issue on one side, I could take up and consider in an equable manner certain considerations I had scarcely dared to think of before, namely, those arising out of the circumstances of my bankruptcy. But now, looking at this matter calmly and at leisure, I could see that if only I suppressed my identity by a temporary assumption of some less well-known name, and if I retained the 2 months' beard that had grown upon me, the risk of any annoyance from the spiteful creditor to whom I had already alluded became very small indeed. From that to a definite course of rational worldly action was plain sailing. It was all amazingly petty, no doubt, but what was there remaining for me to do? Whatever I did, I was resolved that I would keep myself level and right side up. I ordered up writing materials, and addressed a letter to the New Romney Bank, the nearest, the waiter informed me, telling the manager I wished to open an account with him, and requesting him to send 2 trustworthy persons, properly authenticated, in a cab with a good horse to fetch some hundredweight of gold with which I happened to be encumbered. I signed the letter Blake, which seemed to me to be a thoroughly respectable sort of name. This done, I got a Folkestone blue book, picked out an outfitter, and asked him to send a cutter to measure me for a dark tweed suit, ordering at the same time a valise, dressing bag, brown boots, shirts, hat to fit, and so forth, and from a watchmaker I also ordered a watch. And these letters being dispatched, I had up as good as lunch as the hotel could give, and then lay smoking a cigar, as calm and ordinary as possible, until in accordance with my instructions 2 duly authenticated clerks came from the bank and weighed and took away my gold, after which I pulled the clothes over my ears in order to drown any knocking, and went very comfortably to sleep. I went to sleep. No doubt it was a prosaic thing for the first man back from the moon to do, and I can imagine that the young and imaginative reader will find my behavior disappointing. But I was horribly fatigued and bothered, and confound it, what else was there to do? There certainly was not the remotest chance of my being believed if I had told my story then, and it would certainly have subjected me to intolerable annoyances. I went to sleep. When at last I woke up again, I was ready to face the world as I have always been accustomed to face it since I came to years of discretion. And so I got away to Italy, and there it is I am writing this story. If the world will not have it as fact, then the world may take it as fiction. It is no concern of mine. And now that the account is finished, I am amazed to think how completely this adventure is gone and done with. Everybody believes that Cavor was a not very brilliant scientific experimenter who blew up his house and himself at Lympne, and they explained the bang that followed my arrival at Littlestone by a reference to the experiments with explosives that are going on continually at the government establishment of Lyd, 2 miles away. I must confess that hitherto I have not acknowledged my share in the disappearance of Master Tommy Simmons, which was that little boy's name. That perhaps may prove a difficult item of corroboration to explain away. They account for my appearance in rags with 2 bars of indisputable gold upon the Littlestone beach in various ingenious ways. It doesn't worry me what they think of me. They say I've strung all these things together to avoid being questioned too closely as to the source of my wealth. I would like to see the man who could invent a story that would hold together like this one. Well, they must take it as fiction. There it is. I have told my story, and now I suppose I have to take up the worries of this terrestrial life again. Even if one has been to the moon, one has still to earn a living. So I am working here at Amalfi on the scenario of that play I sketched before Cavor came walking into my world, and I am trying to piece my life together as it was before ever I saw him. I must confess that I find it hard to keep my mind on the play when the moonshine comes into my room. It is full moon here, and last night I was out on the pergola for hours, staring away at the shining blankness that hides so much. Imagine it. Tables and chairs, and trestles and bars of gold. Confound it! If only one could hit on that Cavorite again. But a thing like that doesn't come twice in a life. Here I am, a little better off than I was at Lympne, and that is all. And Cavor has committed suicide in a more elaborate way than any human being ever did before. So the story closes as finally and completely as a dream. It fits in so little with all the other things of life. So much of it is so utterly remote from all human experience. The leaping, the eating, the breathing, and these weightless times, that indeed there are moments when, in spite of my moon gold, I do more than half believe myself that the whole thing was a dream. End of chapter.